So when someone is depressed, it's not just about mood. Something fundamentally is changing within the brain. Can you walk us through what actually is happening at the neurological level? How do our circuits controlling reward, motivation, cognitive functions start to break down in someone with depression?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Excited to be here. Really nice to be the first guest on the show. Yeah, and we start with a really interesting question. It's a big question, I think, with sort of quite a big answer. But I'd like to start by saying that depression is really a very variable condition. So between two people, symptoms could be really different. So two people might go to their GP. One person is feeling really tired, they're feeling unmotivated, they're struggling to sort of get up and go, and maybe they've got less appetite than usual. Whereas another person might be struggling with a lot of feelings of guilt and low mood, and maybe struggling to sleep at night as well. But if both of these people go to their GP, they'd both be given a diagnosis of sort of generally depression and offered similar treatments, maybe an antidepressant or psychotherapy typically. But the important thing is that these varying symptom profiles are probably caused by different brain and cognitive changes. So under the hood, different things might be driving these different symptoms. But at the minute, we don't really understand what these nuances are at all. But what we do know is depression is generally associated with changes in brain functioning related to reward processing and to motivation. So one really interesting finding is that there are changes in the functioning of brain circuits. So these are sort of different regions of the brain that speak to each other. And there's one brain circuit that connects a really deep brain region called the striatum, um, which is important for how we process and respond to and learn about rewards, with more frontal areas of the brain. So, sort of involved in higher order learning, in making decisions, in directing our attention, and things like this. And a recent study actually found that this circuit was about 70% larger in people with depression compared to non-depressed people. And what's particularly interesting is that the circuit was found to be bigger in people who weren't depressed but went on later to develop an episode of depression. So we don't know if this change is inherited or maybe it reflects changes in the environment, like childhood stress or something like this. But if we can start to sort of find these changes in the brain, and we can maybe use them to identify people at risk of depression. And then in terms, so we've talked so far about changes on the brain level, but in terms of cognition, so how we actually make decisions, how we sort of navigate the world, how we feel, these brain changes are probably linked to things like impaired decision making and changes in how we learn about reward and process reward that we see in depression as well.
I think the genetic versus environmental sort of causation is quite interesting. Do you think it's a culmination of the two? And, are there maybe, let's say, patients with genetic predispositions, which means they're more vulnerable to, say, trauma, which may shape these sort of circuitries? Or I guess it's very multifaceted and difficult, right, to sort of stratify patients, or is that too complex?
It's something that we, I think, are trying to learn about, but it is really complicated. There are definitely sort of like heritable factors in mental health conditions. So if a close family relative of yours was diagnosed with depression, then there's a sort of a greater likelihood that you might develop depression. But there's no single gene that means that you're likely to get depression or any other mental health condition. It's like lots of genes that all have like a smaller association. So it's sort of quite difficult to use genotyping really to develop like a risk profile or something like that. But if you have certain heritability, sort of a heritable tendency towards depression, for example, and then something happens in your environment which is stressful or traumatic and sort of starts to potentially dysregulate things like the stress systems in your body, then that can sort of lead to a tipping point, which means that you develop a mental health condition. So yeah, it definitely is an interaction between the two. And there are so many genes which influence risk and also so many environmental factors which influence risk as well.
So I read your review, obviously in Nature Translational Psychiatry, and there are two sort of terms that sort of come up, which is anhedonia and apathy. Why do activities that would bring a person typically joy like hobbies or times with loved ones, like family members. Why is that appeal lost in depression?
Yeah, so the experience that you're describing is really common in depression, and we call this anhedonia. So anhedonia is defined as a loss of interest or pleasure in activities that used to be enjoyable. On a cognitive level, we have found that the symptom is associated with, again, with changes in reward processing. So it comes back to this sort of motivational idea. And then on a brain level, it's associated with changes to dopamine functioning and activity of this brain area that I already mentioned, the striatum. Yeah. And we don't really understand exactly what causes anhedonia at the minute, although it's a really interesting symptom. But we think that it might be that when you develop depression, your brain becomes more sensitive to effort. So this is a bit of a weird concept, but all of our brains are constantly weighing up the costs and benefits of doing any effortful action. Like, effort is required everywhere in the world.
Yes.
For example, to get your favorite drink, you might have to walk to a coffee shop. Even, that simple requirement, oh, I just want to go and get like a flat white. Well, I have to put on my coat, I have to walk down the stairs, I have to, in the rain, walk for 5 minutes to the coffee shop. Do I really want to do that? And what you're doing there is weighing up like this cost benefit decision. Like, is it worth me going out to get the drink? So yeah, effort is everywhere. And generally our brains try and avoid high effort actions because they're costly, right? Like, they take a lot of
Yeah.
energy,
Yeah.
but we will do them to get rewards. And we're sort of like, just, it's this seesaw of like reward versus effort that we're just calculating all the time. And we think that in depression, effort is calculated as being like more costly. And this is linked to changes in reward processing and dopamine function in the brain. And this then leads to sort of a reduction in motivation and then a reduction in how pleasurable activities feel. So that's what we think is that sort of cognitive link between dopamine functioning and anhedonia.
So I'm sure we're gonna talk about this more later on, but could you give us sort of a one-liner sentence, let's say, of what's dopamine and what's its function in the brain, just as a sort of little summary?
Yeah, sure. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain. So it allows the brain to sort of send messages between neurons. And we think it's really important in processing reward alongside other functions, but, you know, on a simple level, that's what I'd say.
So we've talked about anhedonia. What about apathy? Why does, you know, decision making, like getting out of bed, why does it feel so overwhelming in depression?
Yeah, so there's a whole cluster of symptoms that are seen alongside anhedonia. So, I mean, it's difficult, it's like cluster of symptoms to deal with. So as well as sort of like losing an interest in things that usually bring you joy, you might also have apathy. So this is quite like conceptually a bit similar to anhedonia, but it is different. It's like a general like loss of get up and go, or like a loss of the feeling of being driven. And then another symptom which quite commonly occurs alongside apathy and anhedonia is fatigue. So this is just like a general loss of energy. And then also feeling like your brain is really foggy. So a feeling of cognitive impairment. All these symptoms can tend to come at the same time, which is, you know, quite difficult and can contribute to everyday activities feeling more overwhelming, definitely. Um, and this whole cluster of symptoms is related to effort sensitivity, we think. So this sort of non-conscious processing where our brains are computing cost of effort and benefits of rewards differently, which is likely to make all sorts of everyday tasks feel like a struggle.
So I've done a bit of work on Parkinson's, and so this is a question really for me, is that the symptoms like apathy and anhedonia, they also appear in other diseases like Parkinson's, also, stroke as a secondary sort of issue. And so why have we got this sort of overlap of symptoms, and what can it sort of reveal about how our brain processes motivation and pleasure?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and like something that we're just starting to appreciate in neuroscience, actually, which is that you see the same symptoms happening across what we think of as really different, like mental or physical health conditions. So it suggests that actually these traditional diagnostic labels that we use are not that helpful in understanding symptoms always. we're trying to understand what's actually going on to sort of cause those symptoms under the hood, as it were. So maybe the changes in Parkinson's disease are somewhat similar to changes in depression. And if we can like start to understand what those changes are, then we might find more effective treatments. Because at the minute it's more sort of a trial and error process to try and find at least drug treatments for these sorts of symptoms. But yeah, thinking more specifically about Parkinson's disease. So yeah, I think generally it's sort of as a neurological disorder, whereas depression is typically thought of as a psychiatric disorder. So you'll know more about this than me. But Parkinson's is characterized by sort of physical symptoms, right, like an involuntary tremor. But it also comes with more psychological symptoms like apathy and anhedonia. And what's really interesting is that Parkinson's disease is caused by changes in dopamine, like depression. And so we think this is linked to apathy and anhedonia. And there's been some really nice work showing that there is indeed like a relationship between dopamine functioning in Parkinson's disease and apathy and anhedonia. And importantly, as the condition progresses over time, this relationship gets stronger. So as dopamine functioning gets worse, its link to apathy and anhedonia gets stronger. And then, so we've got Parkinson's and we've got depression. And as you mentioned, stroke. Schizophrenia is another condition that's caused by changes to the dopamine system in a different way, and it has different symptoms. So when you think of schizophrenia, you often think of delusions and hallucinations. But it's also associated with apathy and anhedonia. And these can be really difficult symptoms to manage. And they're not well treated by antipsychotic medication. But yeah, we know that there are changes in dopamine and in reward processing again in schizophrenia. So just observing across these different conditions, the linking factor does seem to be dopamine functioning and reward processing, which are linked to impairments in motivation. And I guess that's like pretty much as we can say at the moment, but there's a lot of really interesting work going on, which is sort of working to unpick what the mechanisms are and like even looking across these different conditions, like are they this exactly the same mechanism or is there some difference between each condition?
Fascinating. I mean, I'm a big fan of dopamine. I was actually reading Dr. Anna Lemke's book on dopamine and addiction, and I think it plays, no, clearly a pivotal role in different disorders and conditions, and sort of trying to nitpick the mechanism of action in each of these disorders and trying to also understand commonalities and similarities between each mechanism would be, well, interesting, but also, I think, beneficial.
Uh-huh.
So you mentioned medication.
Uh-huh.
How effective are antidepressants at the moment, especially with regards to treating apathy and anhedonia? And is there, can physical activity sort of fill in the gap of limitations, let's say, associated with antidepressants such as SSRIs, I guess? And I presume there's more sort of classes of medications out there.
Yeah, there are different classes of antidepressant medication, but the short answer is they're not very good at treating apathy and anhedonia. These are some of the symptoms which just aren't well treated by the kind of drugs that would be prescribed by your GP. And also, anhedonia is linked to sort of more chronic depression. So if you have anhedonia, you're less likely to respond quickly to treatments and you're more likely to have sort of depression for longer. So it's really important that we understand this better and just find a new treatment because maybe serotonergic antidepressants are typically used are just not really working.
So, sorry, just on that, with regards to current SSRIs, are they targeting the serotonergic system? Or also, are they targeting the dopaminergic system? And what's the difference between the two systems as well? Sorry, I think that's a bit of a big question, but yeah.
So, I mean, it's worth acknowledging that the brain's neurotransmitter systems are really complex and
Mhm.
they all interact with each other.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned a minute ago that, the importance of dopamine in things like addiction. And I've been talking about wanting to sort of unpick dysfunctioning in dopamine to try and find better treatments. One complication is that it's dopamine is everywhere in the brain. It's not just like expressed in one part for one reason. It is expressed in lots of different places. And the same with serotonin. And then there are other neurotransmitters as well, which have their own functions. Glutamate, for example, is another really important chemical messenger. But yeah, typically antidepressants are thought of as sort of targeting the serotonin system. So
Yes.
their primary function is to increase serotonin levels in the brain. And yeah, it's quite weird, isn't it, that we sort of don't have more dopaminergic treatments for depression. Talking about like these motivational impairments and reward processing impairments, like why haven't we got those already? And we have trialed dopamine boosting medication in depression, but so far the success is only limited. It's possible that this is because not everybody who reports feeling depressed needs dopamine medication. Maybe there's only a subset of people that have this like dopaminergic mechanism, and they're the ones that would really benefit from having a boost in their dopamine. Whereas for other types of people, other types of depression, serotonin might be what's going to work best for them. So yeah, so I think like working out who needs what kind of medication and being more targeted about what we give who would be really helpful. But you mentioned also physical activity and whether this might be something that could be helpful as like maybe an adjunct to traditional antidepressants or an alternative. And I think it's good to have like a portfolio of potential treatments. So we already use drugs and psychotherapy, but we know that physical activity in all forms is actually really effective antidepressant. And we think that, again, this is linked to dopamine. So mainly in animals, we've seen that physical activity does give a really good boost to dopamine function, and also in people with Parkinson's disease. And generally, looking across lots of trials, we've seen that physical activity is actually as effective as antidepressants or therapy, especially in people with more severe depressions. So maybe people that are resistant to antidepressant treatments, for example. So it is a really powerful potential treatment for depression. So it definitely works. There's no question about that. But we just don't know exactly how physical activity works in depression, or importantly, who it works for.
So we're going to dive into that, but before we do, I guess let's sort of have a better understanding of the brain reward system and motivation. And so, what exactly is it, and how does dopamine influence both motivation and effort in our daily lives?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's true that we hear sort of the term like reward processing quite often in the media, and it's this sort of like well understood or sort of like well acknowledged phenomenon. But it is good to actually think about like, what does it actually do? What is it really? And try and give an explanation about that. So we live in a really unpredictable world, like a really, really complex world, and we have to navigate this to try and survive. And like all animals, we have sort of evolved over time to deal with this, right? And one of those like really, really fundamental biological functions is to seek out reward. So to pursue outcomes that will be good for our like biological fitness, really. So that will allow us to survive, to thrive, and to sort of continue the like, genetic lineage, really. So this might be like food or sex or social status or something like this. And our reward systems basically optimize our sort of ability to navigate the world to do this. And it's been quite a long time now that we've understood that this is signaled by dopamine neurons in the brain. So we started to understand this in the 90s. And there was some really important research which we discovered that there are particular dopamine neurons that fire when we get reward unexpectedly. So in this experiment, what the scientists would do is like put an electrode directly into a monkey's brain in where the dopamine neurons are, and then give them delicious juice and basically just measure what happens to the dopamine neurons. And these neurons, yeah, they get excited when we unexpectedly get reward, but also they drop their firing when we unexpectedly lose reward. And this is something that's called prediction error, and this allows us to learn about the optimal way to get and keep rewards for next time. So it's basically like expectation updating, just constantly being in this dynamic environment and saying, okay, well, if I do that action, I get a reward. If I do that action, I lose a reward. So I should do the first one rather than the second. And so it's easy to see how this system feeds into motivation, because motivation is the process energizing behavior towards a goal, so like a reward. And the dopamine system helps us to learn which behaviors are more likely to lead to reward, and also makes us more likely to carry out those behaviors in future.
I think with social media, with the modern world, our expectations of reward is almost getting higher. You know, how status should be perceived, how someone should look, all of these sort of external stimuli that initiates reward internally is sort of getting propped up, let's say. Do you think that's having an effect on our sort of brain circuitry and even on, expression of dopamine receptors and whatnot? And do you think that could potentially be linked to, dopamine dysfunction especially in sort of youngsters who may be experiencing depression?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't think that we know the answer to it, but it makes me think about, online you read about things like the dopamine diet. People are sort of promoting the idea that if you just really drop down your stimulation levels, then you're gonna sort of appreciate small things more, I suppose, is like the idea of it, if I
Yeah.
understand it
Yeah.
correctly. Which I mean, obviously there's a lot of wisdom to that, but I don't think it's necessarily like I think it's maybe a bit too much of a jump to assume it's related to dopamine. Like we just don't know.
Hmm.
There's so much that we don't know about dopamine, even when
Yeah.
we look in like really carefully, rigorously controlled experimental conditions. So it's difficult to relate it out to something like social media, for example. But I mean, generally, it's clear that the world is taking up, the way that social media sort of how it functions nowadays, it demands so much of our attention. And we only have limited attentional capacity, really. I think that probably the dopamine system is quite resilient, and I'm not sure exactly, like I just think it's hard to say right now like what kind of changes we would see it as a function of sort of things like social media. But
Yeah.
it's an interesting question. Maybe I'm not exactly the right person to ask. Maybe there is research out there looking at that already.
Yeah, I mean, the bro science simple sort of guy in me is looking at this and thinking social media, dopamine, not a good combination. But like you said, I think it's multifaceted, it's very complex. There are multiple variables at play that are influencing dopamine signaling in individuals, let alone a subset of a population or a patient group.
Mhm.
And so this dopamine detox that we hear about on social media, it's interesting. It's quite funny to watch and then ask a scientist about it rather than, the guy that I go down to the gym with. But yeah, no, I think it's interesting and, potentially I'm going to do some research on social media and dopamine as well and talk to some guys about it because I do think it is important to be considered maybe as a variable and a factor to sort of
Yeah,
delve into.
yeah. I agree completely. I mean, social media has fundamentally changed the world in the last
Yeah.
20 years.
Yeah.
And it's happened without humanity really seemingly consciously sort of thinking about, the effects that the technology might have. And we just don't know what those effects are yet. But yeah, I think they are going to be pretty huge. And it will be interesting to understand more about how that affects the brain, definitely.
So we've touched upon in that in depression, simple tasks can be, very difficult. Washing the dishes, doing your laundry, etc.
Mhm.
Is the brain miscalculating effort versus reward? And if so, what is specifically happening within the sort of reward circuitry?
Yeah. So that's our current understanding is that, yeah, the brain is miscalculating effort versus reward. This is probably not a conscious process. It's not like we know that we're doing it. We don't consciously always weigh up the costs and benefits of decisions. We just decide to do something. But sort of like the idea really is that effort becomes more costly in depression, which makes us less willing to exert it. And in terms of like what happens to reward processing, we've got evidence that reward processing is altered in depression. So in various different ways generally. So for example, like we naturally show a bias towards reward. And if we're in depression, we lose some of that bias. Or when we have depression, we're slower to learn about rewards. So, rewards are really salient things, and usually humans are very quick to learn about them so that we can pursue them. But in depression, this is slowed down. So we can start to sort of see these reward processing changes in depression and think about, well, maybe when we've got this equation where we're weighing up effort versus reward, maybe it's that reward is sort of less weighted in that equation, like it's got less weight to a person with depression. Or, I mean, it could also be that effort is more costly. We can start to understand which side of the equation sort of is having an effect by getting people to sort of play computer games where they have to make the decisions and then applying algorithms to the behavior in the game to try and work out if it's more about like finding effort really costly and not wanting to do it or more about like not really caring about getting rewards. And yeah, actually what we see in those games is that people with depression are just sort of they're finding effort more costly and they're less likely to sort of accept offers to put in effort.
Guess it's almost this negative feedback sort of loop, right? Where if you are depressed and you're almost stuck in this hole, every single day you are seeing a lack of reward. And that's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And so I guess is your brain continuous, I don't want to say deteriorating, but are your reward circuitries just continuously going downhill or in decline in someone with depression, and it's just going to be feeding back and back and back. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there is evidence that we do see some brain changes sort of at the structural level in depression, but the evidence is kind of, is mixed, and they're probably quite subtle changes. So it's not the same as like a neurodegenerative disorder. So something like maybe dementia or Parkinson's or something like that, where you see these physical changes that just continue over time. But there is something about activating the dopamine system, like exciting it and keeping that sort of reward circuit activated, which maybe doesn't happen in the same way in depression. And there is actually a type of psychological therapy called behavioral activation therapy, which, the idea of it is like getting people activated. And maybe also the idea behind giving a dopaminergic drug isn't that somebody with depression just keeps taking the dopamine drug in the same way as like classic antidepressants, but instead they take it for a little while and it sort of activates them so that they can maybe start doing physical activity, for example, or like doing things that they find rewarding, re-engaging with those rewards. And then over time, you can sort of get out of that negative spiral. So yeah, there's definitely this sort of idea of like being stuck in a bit of a negative loop in depression.
yeah, I think this is what is so fascinating about psychiatric disorders compared to, let's say, neurological disorders like Parkinson's. It's, as a scientist, we'd look at neurological disorders and be like, there's a structural change, so X, Y, and Z, here it is. But with psychiatric disorders, it's almost this black hole where you have a good understanding of what's going on neurologically, thanks to, technology, but you can't quantify the mind almost. And so it's sort of trying to understand, how does neural changes affect behavioral changes? And then how does behavioral changes affect us neurally? Is it a two-way street, or, but yeah, I think it's completely fascinating. I think that's why potentially, I'm not a clinician, but the combination of behavioral therapy, but also sort of medications that alter your neurotransmission is potentially very beneficial and should be further explored
Mm,
within the clinic.
mhm.
But anyway, you talked about structural changes, and there's a brain region which I've fallen in love with, thanks to, I don't know if you know Professor Andrew Huberman from Stanford, but he introduced the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, and you mentioned it in your review as well. It's called the AMCC, let's say, and it's received a lot of attention because actually there are studies, and I'm quoting Huberman on this, there are studies showing that in dieters or people who do hard things, the AMCC is actually larger in size, and has been hypothesized, has been shown to be associated with the willpower to live, which I think is, incredibly fascinating as an assumption. So I think you could do a better job at explaining what is this region, and why is it specifically critical for effort-based decisions, and how could, physical activity influence its function?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I know Andrew Huberman has sort of mentioned the AMCC on his
Hmm.
podcast before. He's a big fan of it, and yeah, it's great that sort of this area of the brain, which is so important for so many different functions, is being promoted. I think, like, again, it's really nuanced and really complicated, and we have to be careful about like what kind of statements we make about it. So, like this idea that it might change in was it changing in dieters, like it changed in studies?
Dieters, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I'd be interested to look at that study
Hmm.
and then
Yeah,
review the evidence.
yeah.
Because generally with these sorts of areas, the evidence is more in functioning rather than structure. You can, of course, you see structural changes in different parts of the brain,
Hmm.
like over time because of different processes. But yeah, I would be interested in looking at the evidence that something like a diet could actually, like using willpower, like this very psychological process,
Hmm.
would actually have, because it would have to be a huge change to be able to really like detect that on a structural scan.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
quite interesting.
Yeah.
Certainly, functioning is something that we can look at, and that is something that changes according to sort of different mental states, for example. So when I'm talking about brain functioning, like the way that we characterize this is we look at how much blood is flowing to different areas of the brain, and from that we can make an inference about like what like the neurons must be firing more
Okay.
because lots of blood is going there, which means that like oxygen needs to get to that part of the brain, basically. Yeah. And so, yeah, the AMCC, I also love the AMCC. It's a really fascinating part of the brain, quite a catchy name as well. Uh, so, yeah,
Yeah.
it's the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. But yeah, AMCC is sort of easier. So, yeah, this is like a more frontal region of the brain. So it's like sort of here. And sorry for listeners, yeah, it's sort of like at the top of the edge, really, I'd say. And yeah, it's in real close communication with this area that I've already talked about, the striatum. So the striatum is really involved in reward processing, but the AMCC is more frontal and it's involved in lots of different cognitive functions. So we know that it's really important for processing emotions. We know it's really important for pain perception. We also know it's really important for like directing our attention and sort of having that cognitive control to be goal directed and to sort of fulfill a task. It's also important for if we make an error or we are surprised by something, it processes that error. It's really multifaceted. It's a really fascinating area. Um, and yeah, all of those things that I've talked about, so like emotion processing, sort of directing attention, error detection, and cognitive control, all of these things, like if you think about what motivation is, sort of goal directed behavior, all of these cognitive functions are important for that, right? So yeah, we do think it's really really central to motivation. And in terms of sort of effort based decisions, again, like we're sort of weighing up the outcome versus the cost. It's a very cognitive control-y type thing to do, right? Like you're actually sort of taking a step back and you're looking, or your brain is, and saying, okay, like what could I get out of this, but what would I have to put in? And so the AMCC is an area that sort of makes those like higher level computations. And probably because of its close links to the striatum as well. So the striatum is like this reward processing area of the brain that is like, you know, responding to, oh, we just got some reward, great, like, okay, I'm going to signal up to the AMCC and I'm going to explain that this is something we should do again in future, and then the AMCC will sort of integrate that information for next time. And we do know, we have some evidence that physical activity does influence AMCC function. So at the minute it's sort of like preliminary, like I think we've had one really cool study which looked at activity in this brain region during effort-based decision making before and after like a course of physical activity. And what the study showed is that effortful decisions activated the AMCC less after a course of physical activity. And so we think that might be sort of like the key to what's happening in like the antidepressant effect of physical activity is that the brain is signaling less to effort. The AMCC is signaling less to effort after physical activity, and that's making us like more motivated. Um,
So is there any evidence suggesting that the AMCC's activity may be decreased in patients with depression?
Sorry, could you say the question again?
Is there any sort of evidence, or do you think that the AMCC is decreasing its activity in patients with depression?
The functioning of the AMCC is different in depression, definitely. It really depends on what cognitive function you're looking at. So actually, in effort-based decision making, so it's not always a decrease it shows, which is really interesting. Actually, in depression, AMCC is likely to increase its activity to effort-based decision making, so become more sensitive to effort. So it's in the opposite direction. Yeah, because it's such a hub for the brain and so important for so many different cognitive functions, and part of like a whole circuit that is altered in depression, actually, which involves other areas of the brain, like, for example, the insula. It is altered in depression, definitely. Yeah.
I think again, it's my simple mind looking at it in a sort of, well, there must be one issue with the circuit in depression that's sort of widespread for everyone, but I presume it's based on different, let's say, subtypes of depression or different stratifications of patients, different areas of that circuit is going to be impaired. And so that's what makes treatment, I guess, very difficult, right?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. And this is only, you know, we're only just starting to really get our heads around this in like in neuroscience that if you have a physical health condition, you go to your GP, you describe the symptoms, you'll get sent off for tests, and then they'll come back and then you'll get a diagnosis. It's very precise and specific. But in mental health, generally, you just go to your GP and say how you're feeling, and on the basis of that, you get given a treatment. Like there's no precision in the same
Yeah.
way. And that's what we're trying to move towards now is like a more precise understanding of what is causing all of these different psychiatric conditions. And yeah, we're pretty confident that there will be subtypes of, for example, depression, which are caused by different mechanisms in the brain and will respond to different treatments. Yeah.
So you mentioned how physical activity sort of affects the AMCC, which is good. And so let's sort of delve more into physical activity and effort and reward. Another favorite podcaster of mine, he's called Chris Williamson, and he said this amazing quote, and he said the magic that you're looking for is in the work that you are avoiding. And so I say this as an ultra runner who likes to, run a lot but hates to train. Physical activity when you first start can be really, really uncomfortable, obviously.
Mm.
So I wake up, it's dark, it's cold, especially in the winter. I don't want to go out and run, but it boosts your mood long term, both, patients with depression and also in people who don't have depression. So neurologically, how does the brain balance that sort of immediate discomfort where you wake up and it's like, I really don't want to go out and just go to the gym or do anything. But you know what? Delayed gratification, let me think about the longer term mental health sort of benefits. So how does the brain sort of balance that?
Well, like it's the ultimate like cost benefit decision, isn't it, really? Getting up early and going out for a run in the dark or something like that is pretty costly. Like a lot of effort involved in doing that.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of cognitive control. And yeah, your brain is weighing that up and probably telling you to stay in bed instead of going out. And you have to really, you have to sort of override that.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, in a general sense, if the reward that you can get in from doing the activity is overall higher than the cost of the effort, then you will be motivated to do the effortful action. Like that's the simple way of looking at it. And it's difficult in depression because if you are more sensitive to effort, then physical activity will feel more effortful to begin with. So your cost benefit decision is more likely to be tipped towards not doing it. So yeah, we need to find ways to support people to do more physical activity so that over time effort sensitivity will hopefully decrease and then it will become easier to be motivated. But that's just like one part of the answer. I think it is a really interesting question. I mean, there are lots of changes going on in physical activity in particular. In the short term, as well as sort of these dopamine changes, in the shorter term, you see release of endogenous cannabinoids, so a different type of chemical in the brain. And this is what people are talking about when they talk about endorphins. So it's that like short term release of like chemicals in the brain that make you feel great. And that does happen when you do physical activity. And I think like the more that you do activity, the fitter that you get, the more that you start to learn that okay, if I do go to the effort of going outside and doing this, I will feel great afterwards. Like it's that learning process.
Yeah, I mean, what I sort of really find interesting with this sort of, this effort and reward sort of topic is the fact that you sort of have to, I don't know if this is correct and this could be sort of explained scientifically, but you always have to ignore your feelings, if that makes sense. And so it's almost like you have to go into this sort of robotic mode where you ignore your feelings and you just go out and you do the action and you trust the process that, yes, right now it sucks,
Hmm.
but along the line, it's going to be beneficial to me. So I'm not going to feel, the discomfort and I'm not going to acknowledge the discomfort. I'm just going to go out and do it. And, this too shall pass almost.
Yeah, yeah.
So what kind of variables is it just purely neurological and you sort of need to take your feelings and detach from it or?
Mm. Yeah, I'm just wondering, like when you started getting into ultra running or running in general, like did you find it like how did you do that at the beginning? Was it a lot harder then? And did you build habits that made you like is it like if you put out your running clothes the night before, you're more likely to go for a run the next morning, for example?
Yeah, yeah, it's even now. every morning is a battle. It's almost like, and I think this is very interesting when it comes to motivation versus discipline, where it's like I just have to do it, and I've been doing it for so long, like it's just a part of my life. And I think we mentioned before how depression's almost this negative feedback where, you're going to stay in bed, you're going to stay in bed, and you're going to feel like you're in this hole. But
Mm,
the upside of physical activity is that once you do it once, then twice, then three times, and you get into momentum, is
mm.
it's the opposite.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of, I guess, getting over that initial discomfort, that little hump. And then once it's there, it's almost smooth sailing. But I've looked at this only from a purely sort of psychological perspective where it's just like, ignore your feelings, Aaron. That's it. But I don't know if there's any sort of science behind it with regards to neural signaling and any changes that are occurring on that on a neurological level.
I think that there are different, cognitive processes happening in the brain all the time, of course. And one of these is effort-based decision making. And also, effort-based decision making will happen at lots of different levels. Like it will happen probably at like very non-conscious levels, but also maybe it is also happening at more conscious levels. Maybe this is the same process. And I think that if we had to deliberate about a decision every time we had to make one, sometimes we do deliberate, and that's quite costly. That's quite hard work in itself. It takes quite a lot of cognitive energy. And what you're describing sounds more like you have stopped doing that, or maybe you just choose not to do that with physical activity, with the run, and instead you sort of rely on like more of a habitual system. Like it's like a habit that you formed. And yeah, I think once you start to rely on a habit instead of being like, am I going to do this today? Am I not? Like you just go into the habit. Our brains are, I think, run much more efficiently when they are just using like these habits, which is, there's a downside to that too. Like if you get into the habit of having like negative thoughts or like thinking repeatedly or ruminating on the same topic, it's really difficult to get out of that because we are, we do form like habits. It is like something that our brain is built to do. But, on the plus side of habit forming, like are things like finding it easier just to export those decisions and just rely on your habit and just do it, just go for a run. But yeah, I think, so there are lots of psychological factors that are important in making physical activity more attractive, and it will really vary according to the individual. Like maybe having like a social element is helpful for some people, or being out in nature is helpful for other people. And I think also once you start with doing physical activity, there will be psychological effects that make it easier to carry on as well. Like a stronger sense of like I can achieve this, like I can do this. I have more self like efficacy. I'm effective. Also higher levels of self-esteem too, which make it easier. Um,
Yeah, I mean, just quickly on that before we move on, there's a famous ultra runner I'm a big fan of, David Goggins, and he has a concept called the cookie jar mentality. And with the cookie jar mentality, it's you remember all the hard times that you've gone through that could be, both physical and mental, and you use that as, let's say, motivation or as fuel to, carry on with your, future endeavors. And so again, I think this is why this conversation is so fascinating, because I've looked at physical activity on purely just a psychological level.
Mhm.
But now we're delving into, okay, but what's happening on a sort of neurological level from a neuroscience perspective. And I've come across BDNF, brain derived nootropic factor, if I'm correct.
Mhm.
And physical activity can increase BDNF signaling,
Yeah,
correct? Or
yeah.
so can we, I guess, not only on the psychological level, but on a neural level, can we sort of use neuroplasticity to improve our resilience to stress and setbacks through sort of physical activity? Again, just a great quote by David Goggins is that he says, I don't run, I don't train for races, I train for my life and for my mentality. Again, psychologically, I get it, but you know, what's going on with BDNF and all of that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's fascinating on a psychological level as well as like a neurological level. And yeah, I think stress has got like a lot to answer for. Uh, we don't always know where the root of mental health conditions is, but I think a lot of the time it comes from the fact that we live in like a really stressful world, and it's like just a constant barrage, and we're all just trying to cope with this all the time. And some people find less adaptive coping mechanisms, which, or their brains respond in a certain way, which might lead to things like depression. But yeah, I think physical activity on a neurological level has lots of different effects on the brain. And yeah, generally really just beneficial. Like if you think about a drug, like an antidepressant will have some benefits, but it might also come with side effects. Whereas physical activity, like it doesn't really have any real negative side effects. So yeah, BDNF is like a protein in the brain which supports and encourages the growth of neurons. So it's very important. And there's evidence, at least in animals, that physical activity boosts this protein, which is probably really important for like supporting like the well-being of the brain. May also have a beneficial effect on mood and cognition. We haven't really got that much evidence for this in human brains at the minute, just because it's more difficult to measure these kind of cellular changes. But there's also evidence that physical activity does actually have an impact on the structure of the brain. There's evidence that it increases the volume of the cortex, and this is the outer layer of the brain that's like really important for higher level processing, so things like language, memory, and decision making. And there is some evidence that it becomes thicker as a result of physical activity. And then, interestingly, there's some evidence as well that physical activity has an effect on cortisol levels. So this is like a really sort of tangible result of sort of a system that is really impacted by stress. So our sort of stress response system is our cortisol system. And when we get stressed, cortisol is released, and cortisol functioning is altered in some people with depression. We know that. Um, it's really interesting line of inquiry to sort of try and understand, well, what is the effect that physical activity has on cortisol? Because like, yeah, as I said, I mean, I think that stress is the root of a lot of sort of mental health issues. So if we can get back to sort of regulating the stress response system, and that would have sort of like a downstream benefit on so many different like elements of brain function. Yeah, overall physical activity I think supports the resilience of the brain and also new growth in the brain, and maybe changes our response to stress. And all of these things are definitely going to make us more resilient to stress in the longer run. So I think, as well as at a psychological level, on a neurological level, yeah, physical activity is sort of important for every day, really.
It's interesting how you bring out sort of stress and lifestyle. I think we're going to talk about this a bit more, but people who maybe have more time to exercise, probably this is going to be a terrible sort of association, but let's say people who maybe have more time to exercise may have stressful lives because they have that time to go to the gym. They're not, working X amount of hours a day. Like that's just life. It's a generalization. I'm sure not everyone is in that sort of boot camp, but you hear that saying exercise is a great de-stressor. Why is that? Is that just because of the release of endorphins in the short term? Is it that simple? So yeah, I mean, like if I have a long day in a lab, then I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna go to the gym, or I'm gonna, go out for a run just to de-stress. And I feel great afterwards. So yeah, is it just because of that release of endorphin?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think endorphins definitely have something to do with it. But there's also this theory that exercise sort of like resets our stress system in a
Okay.
way. Like there are two sort of sides of like the how our characterization of the nervous system. There's like the side that's more to do with like rest and like nutrition and things like that, which is sort of known as the parasympathetic nervous system. And then there's the side which is more about like short-term responses to stress, which is like the sympathetic nervous system. And there is a theory that physical activity almost like shakes up like the sympathetic nervous system. Like if your stress levels are sort of gradually increasing over the day as like small things just like stress you out a little bit more, like you want the stress response to come back down to here, right?
Mm,
And maybe like one way to do that is just to actually physically stress the system, like give it a shake, and then it will
yeah,
settle back down to a nice baseline. So yeah, that's a really nice way of thinking about it.
yeah, yeah. That's giving me more of an incentive to go out and run and go to the gym. Um, so when we sort of we've touched upon the antidepressant effects of physical activity. How does that compare to medication on its own? And is there also evidence looking at physical activity versus physical activity in conjunction with medication? And, then we can become really granular and look at those different types of medication, but I think that's a bit too much. So, what's the evidence saying with regards to comparison of the effects between medication and physical activity?
So yeah, there's really strong evidence that physical activity is really works as an antidepressant. And this isn't even trying to look into subtypes of depression. This is just looking across people. So maybe if we can be more specific, then the effect would be even stronger. We know that generally, if you're more active as a person, then you've got less of a risk of developing depression. So one example statistic that one study showed is that exercising for 4 hours a week means that you have 18% lower risk of developing depression. So it's quite a striking sort of result, I think. But yeah, this only tells us about an association, and it sort of relates back to what you were saying a minute ago, that it might be that if you have more free time, then you can be more physically active, but perhaps your life is less stressful as well. And like, who knows which one of those variables is actually affecting your mental health? Is it that you're active, or is it that you're not stressed? But we can sort of look at the effects of physical activity like it's a treatment, as a treatment, in the same way that you would with a drug, using what's called a randomized control trial, where you sort of deliver the treatment in a really controlled way. And we've done this a lot with physical activity and depression. And, study after study indicates that like there's a substantial effect. In terms of comparing its effect against like more standard treatments like medication and therapy, there's actually evidence that it might be better at treating depression symptoms, like, especially in people with more severe depression. But yeah, I agree. It's probably more beneficial in certain groups of people. So it might be that people who have changes in their dopamine functioning, or people that are less motivated, would benefit more from a physical activity program. And then, yeah, I don't think we really know at the minute if it will work better as a standalone treatment, or if it will be better as like a combination therapy with a drug. But, I can envisage a world in the future where if you go to your GP and they decide that you're depressed, especially if you have motivational symptoms, that as well as the typical answer now, which is like, would you like an antidepressant? Or we can put you on a waiting list for example, CBT. They would say, or we can prescribe you 8 weeks of, I don't know, yoga, or 8 weeks of like aerobic exercise in your local gym if you'd be interested in that. And by the way, this already happens in other countries.
Australia.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And in that case, maybe you be prescribed one, maybe you be prescribed another, maybe be prescribed both at the same time. Like, but surely having more options is better.
Yeah, I think what's really sort of interesting, and I think maybe ironic really, is that depression, like we've said, is multifaceted, and it's very difficult to pinpoint the exact cause of what's going on, both in someone's sort of day-to-day life and with regards to triggers and stress, but also on a neural level. And yet, the answer from a medical standpoint is, let's just target this specific system with this specific antidepressant, which is ironic. But with exercise, yes, it may not be as clean and targeted as antidepressants, but when you're doing a physical activity, you've got that social element, you're going outside, you're releasing your endorphins, you're moving around, you feel good. There are multiple benefits, and even though we don't know why they're all beneficial, let's say on a scientific or neural level, I think it's better to increase your odds almost of success of trying to climb out of this hole um, when in depression. So I think it's quite ironic that we're treating a disease that we don't really know the mechanisms. Well, we do know the mechanisms, but we could have a better understanding with just a singular sort of targeted drug, let's say, instead of exploring other options based on the patient and their own personal past goals and a future.
Yeah.
Is that an apt analysis or?
Yeah. I think it is. I agree with you. And by the way, exercise could be also a targeted treatment. Like
Okay.
there have been studies looking at different types of physical activity and how they work differently, like comparing like dance to like aerobic exercise to to like
Mm.
yoga or to other types of physical activity. Weight training is another one. Yeah, really interesting finding that actually if you like the combined effect of weight training and aerobic exercise is lower on depression than like each individual effect. So if you just do weight training or you just do aerobic exercise,
Hmm.
the effect is stronger. The antidepressant effect is stronger. And probably the reason for that is that weight training, the mechanism by which weight training like boosts mood is probably different to the mechanism by which aerobic exercise boosts mood. And like if you combine them together, then you're just sort of mixing them up and diluting them. But really, like maybe one day we could identify who weight training would be best for, and we could say to those people, like, why don't you try like a program of that? Whereas for a different type of person, it might be aerobic exercise. So yeah, we can be super targeted, or we could be super targeted potentially with prescription of physical activity as well. But I completely agree. Like there are so many different elements to physical activity that might be beneficial. As you say, like getting outside, being in nature is such an important one as well. Like I think being surrounded by birds and trees has a real boost for some people. Listening to music, like having that headspace, maybe doing it in a social setting, like the feeling of, I think it's really important that feeling of like achievement that you've achieved something for yourself, like a boost to self-esteem and self-efficacy, possible improvements in sleep because sort of your system's better regulated, and like the release of endorphins, as well as changes potentially to inflammation over time. So yeah, lots of different benefits. And I think also antidepressants have lots of different effects on the brain as well. Like generally psychiatric drugs can change different systems. They usually have an effect on more than one system. So maybe they're not that targeted either. Usually with antidepressants, it's like a trial by error kind of process to try and find the right antidepressant for somebody, or the same with like a different type of psychiatric drug. So you would go to your GP and say, like, I'm feeling depressed, and they would try you on one. They'd say, try this, see how you go on in the next 2 or 3 months, and then come back if you're struggling with side effects or if you're not feeling any better. So then you have to go through that process of waiting 3 months to start to feel better. And then you have to go back again. And, for some people, this will happen like multiple times. And then, especially if they're experiencing treatment resistant depression, then that's going to take them a really long time to try and find a solution that works for them. And they end up having to tolerate not only the symptoms of depression, but the side effects of different medication for quite a long time. And yeah, we actually, be it physical activity or be it drugs, we would do better to be much more specific about like who we give what kind of treatment to.
Yeah. I'm a real big advocate for exercise and physical activity and whatnot, especially with side effects associated with antidepressants. And that's not me hating on antidepressants. I think go to your clinician and talk to them, obviously. But I think one of the purposes of this episode is to really gain sort of awareness around the benefits of physical activity as well. So you mentioned inflammation, which piqued my interest because I would have never in a million years associated chronic or acute inflammation with depression. So how does chronic inflammation play a role in depression? And specifically, how does it affect dopamine and how does physical activity fight against that? Because one could argue if you're over exercising and over exerting yourself, you might damage your body. And as an ultra runner, I'm used to it. But yeah, what's your take on it?
So yeah, I think inflammation is a really interesting area of inquiry, and I think like we're starting to switch onto it in so many different areas of research and like understanding well-being as a whole. So it's not, in a way it's not surprising that it's made its way over to mental health, like that was going to happen
Mhm, mhm.
at some point. But there does seem to be like, and if you think about it conceptually, it makes sense because if you get like the flu or some sort of, infection or something, what will happen is that you will feel tired. You won't want to go out and talk to people. Like you basically retreat a bit and maybe like your appetite goes down or something like that. That's actually a really adaptive response because what that is doing is stopping us from going out and expending loads of energy and taking risks and doing all the things that we would do usually, because we need to prioritize healing instead. We only have limited, so much energy, and we need to prioritize it to getting better. So it's a really helpful adaptive response when we have an infection. But yeah, those kind of experiences that we have when we're inflamed actually have quite a lot of overlap with depression symptoms, right? Like low energy, like not feeling motivated to go out, like not wanting to socialize, things like that. And I think maybe this was one of the first reasons why we started to think, well, maybe inflammation does play a role in depression, because it's almost like inflammation makes you feel a bit depressed. And there's now lots of evidence that there is a link. One study that I can think of looked at inflammatory events and then the likelihood of reporting depression symptoms a few years later, and there was a relationship. So if you had two inflammatory events and then they looked at the likelihood 5 years later, then you were much more likely to feeling like anhedonia or feeling like things are really effortful. There's also quite a cool series of experiments that actually inflame people there and then, so give them something that makes their immune system sort of go into a bit of an overdrive. They get inflamed and then they start to feel rubbish, and then you can get them to do something like effort-based decision making. And what we've actually seen is that people are less willing to expend effort when they're inflamed. So there really does seem to be a link there. And in terms of what is that mechanism, I don't think we know exactly, but perhaps again it comes back down to stress. If you're in a stressful, unpredictable, difficult environment, then your stress response is going to start to not be regulated in the right way.
Yeah.
And maybe you're also, maybe your immune response is going to become dysregulated, and stress and inflammation are linked. And so if you have this constant low-lying sort of level of stress and this constant low-lying level of inflammation, then over time that might generate depression symptoms. Yeah, so it's worth saying the inflammatory response is getting a lot of stick at the minute. Inflammation is out there and it's being thought of as something that can cause us all sorts of problems. And it is a really interesting area and probably really useful area. But it's worth noting that in a healthy person, inflammation is a really useful and important part of being healthy, because it's part of a healthy response to tissue injury or infection. It helps us to get better. But the problem is if we stay inflamed after the infection or injury has passed, and this is where it might turn into having a negative effect on brain function and mood. And then, yeah, so in terms of what happens in the brain, so we think that this systemic inflammation, so inflammation in the body, disrupts dopamine function in the brain in some way. Maybe some people are more vulnerable to that if they have, for example, a more leaky, what's called a blood-brain barrier. So more stuff basically passes between their blood and their brain, then maybe inflammation will affect their dopamine functioning more. But yeah, this is what we think happens. And there's evidence that inflammation is associated with disrupted dopamine functioning as well, particularly in animal studies. Physical activity does reduce inflammation. It's interesting that you bring up sort of the short-term effects, because actually immediately after you do physical activity, your inflammatory response will go up, which makes sense because you're putting yourself through this thing. You're shaking everything up in your body, you're sort of almost dysregulating all of your respiratory system, your cardiac system, everything's going into overdrive, and then you stop. And actually what happens at that point is that you get this net inflammatory, you get this sort of short-term, inflammatory response. So you'll get a spike straight after physical activity. But if you keep doing that again and again, over time, you get this net drop in inflammation. And that's what's really helpful in depression. Yeah. So muscle contraction itself is anti-inflammatory because it releases proteins which coordinate the inflammatory response. And also physical activity might lead to changes in adipose tissue, so fat
Ooh.
cells. Fat cell, adipose tissue itself is pro-inflammatory. So it's not the volume of adipose tissue that's inflammatory, but
Mhm.
size of individual adipose cells and their location. So more visceral fat is more inflammatory. And so maybe physical activity has an effect on these cells, and that could also be why it's anti-inflammatory. But it's worth noting that the anti-inflammatory effect of physical activity is seen over and above any weight loss. So it's not just about that.
That's that's sort of shone a whole new light on depression and mental health. And you've brought up the blood-brain barrier as well, which I'm a big fan of. But this is really just a thought experiment, an impulsive one. There's links between processed foods, diet, and increased inflammation. and obviously extensive work on the gut-brain axis as well. From a neurological perspective, I have quite a bit of knowledge on that. But let's say, there's someone who's depressed and they're constantly just putting themselves in processed foods because they don't want to, get up and cook and whatnot. Do you assume or hypothesize that, if there is a link between processed food and inflammation, that again, you're sort of feeding this negative cycle? And instead, it's better just to have a bowl of fruit or, try and find ways to reduce inflammation in the easiest ways possible. If there is a strong sort of link. I know, it's still early days with regards to it, but it was just a thought.
Yeah, it's interesting. The gut-brain axis is not my area of expertise. Like, I don't know that much about it or what the link is between like inflammation and the gut and the brain and depression. But I would say that the world is full of things that are stressful or that are pro-inflammatory. And it seems sensible to me to try and minimize exposure to those where we can. It's pretty difficult, especially if you live in a city, you're surrounded by noise and pollution, and depending on sort of like your socioeconomic status, it may be easier or more difficult to like avoid things like processed food or, you know, stress. But I think, yeah, let's avoid them where we can, really. What do you know of evidence for a link between like the gut-brain axis and inflammation and mental health?
So there is, from a neurodegeneration perspective, there's upcoming research on the links between bacterial populations within the gut and dopamine signaling. And so, there's even people working on probiotics and whatnot to try and modulate neurotransmission via the gut brain axis. And so I'm just thinking, if we were to extend that, and you hear a lot in social media now and pseudoscience, like, what you eat will determine your mental health and all of that malarkey. But I was just wondering if there's any sort of clear preclinical, evidence or even assumptions to come to that sort of assumption, if that makes sense. I think it's an interesting line and potentially something that should be explored. But yeah, I'm sort of a fan of the gut brain axis. I think it's fascinating and it's underexplored, I think, with regards to mental health compared to neurological disorders.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I would be interested to know more.
I mean, if I find any papers, I will send them over. But yeah. So we've established that starting physical activity when depressed can almost be near to impossible, and that's because of this sort of extreme effort sensitivity. And so, do you think for anyone out there who is experiencing depression or even these sort of symptoms of apathy and Anhedonia, could understanding the neuroscience behind effort, even on the simplest terms, help someone approach physical activity differently now? Or is it just about discipline? Or is there a smarter way to start? How does understanding the neuroscience help?
Yeah, I think I'd say a few things. I think the first thing is that being aware of the fact that effort sensitivity is higher in some people who are depressed is just generally useful because that will help one to understand that the fact that doing physical activity feels really difficult might actually be a symptom of feeling depressed. So it's something to actually just be aware of and to manage carefully and I guess, be sort of self-compassionate about. Be like, this is actually part of feeling depressed that I really don't want to go and exercise or don't want to go and do physical activity. I'd also say it's probably important for somebody who isn't already active to try not to do too much or too sort of intense physical activity too quickly, but just start small. Aim for like a manageable amount of activity for you individually. One thing which some people find really useful is to have structure because a symptom of depression is struggling in making decisions and planning things. So even just the thought of like trying to work out what physical activity to do can be overwhelming. So joining like a schedule of classes, for example, might be useful so that this is like managed for you. And yeah, as we already talked about, once you start to build a habit, it becomes much easier to maintain it over time. So it might be that you start by joining a prearranged schedule that's quite low intensity and then you build it over time. And then the other thing is that you need to do something that you enjoy. For some people it might be like a social element or being in nature as we talked about. But if we think back to that calculation that your brain is constantly doing about like a reward versus the effort cost. Like try and optimize the level of reward. Don't punish yourself, but just try and find something that does feel good for you. So you're not just constantly battling with your brain.
Yeah, I think it's always, I've experienced apathy and anhedonia, and during the most stressful times of my life, and it's that initial hump which is always the difficult sort of aspect, especially when you go from running marathons every week to doing zero. But I think the one thing I've learned, and talking to other people as well, is you've got to almost restructure and reframe your thinking with regards to your relationship with physical activity. So it's sort of telling yourself, okay, I'm breathing, I'm alive. If I get out and I go for a walk, that's good enough. That's a small win. And then tomorrow it's going to be a walk for 30 minutes or a run for a kilometer. And so it's building up those small wins and sort of making it, like you said, habitual. And, would you even go further in saying that you're sort of, let's say, reigniting or retraining that sort of dopamine pathway almost, where, again, very simplistic, but if you're depressed and you're experiencing anhedonia and apathy, let's just say your dopamine is just zilch. It's just not functioning properly. And so you have to go, okay, look, in order for me to get better, I need to go out for a run. I need to just go out for a walk, and I just need to continuously get better and retrain my dopamine system. And by doing so, my symptoms will hopefully decrease. And it's, having that sort of element of faith. But I think if you know the science, even on the most simplistic terms, then having hope is so much stronger when you're within that hole. Because, essentially it is a negative spiral.
Yeah.
And, like I said, it's really stripping it away back and being like, I'm alive, I'm breathing, I can move. So if I can do that, then I can get better. So yeah.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you that sort of finding these small wins day to day is a way to sort of move away from like that sort of negative cycle. And I think that you can think about it in terms of expectation in a way. I find expectations really interesting because they really shape how we see everything all of the time. And we know that in depression, one of the tendencies is to sort of become, we all have like, as we talked about, like sort of like habitual brains, we get into habits and that's actually really helpful. But in depression, we can get into negative habits. We can start to ruminate. And our expectations might become more negative and become more difficult to shift, like become less flexible. And if we can find these small wins, mm, it makes sense that over time, maybe we'll shift our expectations to be more optimistic, to be more hopeful. And yeah, I think we already are trying to do that with things like behavioral activation therapy. But I do think it's something that we could look more into as well,
Mm,
definitely understand more about.
mm.
But in when the reward system only responds to like unexpected reward. So sorry, the dopamine system only responds to unexpected reward. So if you know that a reward is coming, you know everything about it. Those dopamine neurons that I was talking about earlier, they won't fire. They only fire if it's like surprising.
Right.
So it's actually like a learning system. It's not just about like enjoying something. You have to need to learn about it. So there's something there about like, yeah, like finding new rewards, finding like new ways of exploring the world, like maybe shifting into that sort of exploration process.
Yeah, I think that's actually very interesting, sort of linking the psychology to neuroscience, let's say, because that sort of thought of exploring and trying out new things is probably something that someone with depression needs to sort of tell themselves that, look, I'm going out and I'm going to explore new things and I'm ready for it. And that's going to give them hope and, fuel to keep on trying to get out of this hole. And I
And
guess, yeah, sorry.
well, that's something that we look at as well is
Yeah.
exploration. Like we have particular computer games that we use to try and characterize that in people, different types of people,
Mm.
different conditions, because this sort of like tendency to go out and look for novelty and like explore new parts of the world is something that does change, that can be altered by mental health conditions like depression.
Yeah. And I think maybe that's why, you know, doing sort of scheduled classes with people is also really important because you have that sort of unpredictability, let's say compared to just going out for a run every
Mhm.
day. That's quite predictable. If you're going to a class every day in a different, it's the same environment, so you have that structure, but you might have different people there, or someone new might come in, you might do a different exercise. And so I think that's actually very interesting. And maybe potentially a hack that someone could sort of implement. It's like it's not just going to the gym. It's not just going out for a run, it's going to a class, and it's integrating with different people, and it's exploring the world and then utilizing that to explore yourself as well, and get better. And like you said, there is a scientific reasoning behind it with regards to dopamine, which I think is plausible, and definitely something that should be explored by clinicians here and by anyone listening to this.
And it's definitely, we're looking more into this as well. These errors, these surprising outcomes, can we
Yeah.
use them in, maybe already in some types of psychotherapy, we do use those, right?
Mhm.
Because you say to people, this is what you're expecting, but maybe this is going to happen instead. And if you go out, for example, if you have social anxiety and you're expecting for a social interaction to go very badly, but then you go and have a social interaction and you have a nice conversation and you feel good, then that's a big positive error. And maybe that's going to work, to update your expectations and make you less socially anxious. And in therapy, that principle is already used to some extent. But I think we don't understand it fully, and it is something interesting to look further into.
This is super exciting, super exciting. I wish I could talk to you for more. But final question: considering everything that we've sort of discussed today, what's the one sort of key takeaway you hope that our listeners can remember from our conversation today?
I think the main takeaway is that physical activity is a really powerful tool in managing depression, not only because it improves mood, but because it directly influences brain function, supports brain health, enhances dopamine signaling, boosts motivation, which can be really helpful. But it's about finding something that works for you and starting small and building gradually, and sort of trying to incorporate physical activity into your life alongside other things that might be helpful for you to improve mental as well as physical health.
Yeah, I think one thing that we can all take away from this is that physical activity is not just something to implement for your physical health, ironically, but for your mental health.
Mhm.
And starting small and understanding why it's so beneficial, I think is really important for those, especially experiencing depression, to try and get out of that hole. So yeah, super, super sort of interesting. And I've learned a lot. I hope, you know, people listening will have learned a lot. Yeah, go out and exercise and have some fun. But yeah, cool. Thank you so much, Dr. Hurd. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. Had some really interesting conversations and inspired off some thoughts for me as well.
Perfect. Perfect.